I worked a double shift on my birthday, hoping to treat myself to something small that evening, a quiet dinner, maybe a movie alone. At 5:47 p.m., while clearing dishes in the studio break room, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my dad. "We sold your car. Family comes first. Be grateful. We still let you live here." I froze, hands still wet from rinsing cups. I'm not sure if I had misread it, but no, it was clear. The Toyota Prius I had spent 4 years saving for. The one with my name on the title, purchased entirely with my post-production freelance pay. Gone. Just like that. And the worst part wasn't just that they sold it. It was that they didn't tell me. They didn't ask. They didn't even pretend to care that it was mine. My name is Domalipa, and I'm 26 years old. I work as a post-production specialist at a mid-sized creative agency in San Diego, mostly editing commercial reels and social content for big-name brands. It's not glamorous, but it's steady work, and I've built a reputation for being fast, reliable, and fiercely independent. That last part wasn't by choice. Growing up in a house where personal boundaries were invisible and emotional debts were always accumulating taught me early that if I didn't protect what was mine, no one else would. I still lived with my parents, though not out of failure or convenience. It started as a temporary solution during the pandemic when my industry took a hit, but 3 years later, I was still there, paying rent, buying my own groceries, and contributing more than I ever got back. My little brother Nico, on the other hand, I had just turned 19. He didn't pay rent, didn't have a job, had a brand new MacBook and the latest iPhone, both paid for by our parents, who said he needed them to succeed. He'd been accepted into a private university upstate, and the whole house buzzed with pride and anticipation. I was happy for him. At least, I thought I was, until I realized where the tuition money had come from. See? That car wasn't just transportation. It was proof. It was the tangible result of every weekend I worked instead of resting. Every gig I picked up while juggling deadlines. Every small luxury I denied myself. 4 years of scrimping, saving, and sacrificing went into it. I'd chosen that specific model because it was reliable and fuel-efficient. I handled the paperwork. I negotiated the deal. It was mine. Or so I believed. When I got that text from my dad, I stepped outside into the alley behind the office, hands trembling, and called him. He didn't sound angry. He sounded calm. Like what he'd done was completely rational. He said the car was just sitting there most of the week, depreciating, that it made financial sense to use it for Nico's tuition deposit, that I'd still have access to public transportation, and that, anyway, I owed the family more than I realized. He even called it a collective decision. When I asked how he sold it without my signature, he told me, plainly, that he'd kept copies of all my paperwork just in case, and had used a version of my signature from a prior document. I asked if he'd forged it. He laughed and said not to be dramatic. I reminded him the car was legally in my name. He said that being part of a family meant not holding things over each other, that we were supposed to share, that Nico's future came first. And when I told him I needed that car for my own job interviews and night shifts, he said, "Then walk. Or figure it out. You're resourceful." That conversation ended with him hanging up after saying, "You're lucky we haven't asked you to cover more." I stood there in the cooling light, phone still in my hand, breathing hard through the shock. That was the moment something broke. Not just trust, but a quiet illusion I hadn't realized I still believed in. That if I worked hard, followed the rules, and proved myself useful, I would eventually be respected. That maybe, just maybe, one day, I would stop being the family's emergency backup generator, the dependable one, who always absorbed the damage without complaint. But instead, I'd been used again. And this time, it felt finer, not loud or dramatic, just cold, clean, like someone flipping a switch. I returned to the studio floor and finished my shift. I smiled when the director passed by. I responded to Slack messages. I even exported a final cut for a client with a happy birthday watermark as a joke. But my insides were hollow. That night, when I walked the 30-minute route home under a sky that had already turned deep blue, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just counted the steps and thought about every time I had let something slide in the name of peace. Every time I said yes when I meant no. Every time I downplayed what was taken from me to keep the family from fracturing. But something was shifting now. Something quiet and irreversible. I just didn't know where it would take me yet. The next morning, I woke before my alarm, not because I was rested, but because the tension in my chest never let me fall fully asleep. The text, the call, the silence in my childhood room that now felt like a stranger's space, it all sat on me like a second skin. I checked the driveway before leaving for work, as if hoping the car had magically returned, as if this was all some miscommunication. But the space was still empty. I took the bus into the city, clutching my tote with every document I still had, wondering what exactly my father had used to sell the car, and what else he might have touched. At lunch, I cornered Avery, my closest friend at the agency. She was 2 years older, sharper than she let on, and one of the few people who never pitied me when I talked about family. I kept my voice low as I explained what happened, unsure how much to reveal. But when I mentioned the forged signature, she didn't hesitate. "You need to check your credit report today," she said firmly, already pulling out her tablet to show me how. I did it on my phone, hands sweating, heart crawling into my throat. At first, everything looked normal. One auto loan I recognized, a couple of closed accounts. Then I scrolled further and found 3 open credit lines I didn't recognize, and one personal loan with my name and social security number attached to it. My stomach flipped. I looked again. The balance was nearly $10,000, opened 6 months ago. Right around the time my dad claimed he needed help paying off a short-term tax issue. I remembered signing a blank form at the time. Something he said was for bank verification. I hadn't thought twice. Avery sat quietly while I stared at the screen, then said what I already knew. "That's identity theft." I nodded slowly, but the words felt distant. Identity theft. Fraud. My own father. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a daze, mechanically finishing my client tasks while something colder and harder formed in my mind. That night, I didn't go straight home. I went to the UPS store and requested a printed copy of all 3 credit bureau reports. The clerk handed them to me without comment, though I saw her eyes linger on my trembling hands. At home, I read every page at the kitchen table while my mother cooked in the background, humming as if nothing had changed. I didn't confront her. Not yet. She looked tired, small, like someone who had made herself invisible for so long she'd forgotten how to speak truth out loud. That weekend, I quietly visited my bank, requesting new accounts and explaining I'd been the victim of unauthorized activity. I didn't use the word father. It felt wrong to say aloud. I switched my direct deposit and froze the existing auto loan account, just in case. I also filed an identity theft affidavit online and saved every file to both my phone and cloud drive. The more steps I took, the clearer my thoughts became. Not angry, not revenge-hungry. By the time Monday came, I'd already moved most of my belongings into storage in the back of Avery's garage. She had offered without me asking. "I don't think they're done with you," she said simply, and I believed her. My family wasn't malicious in the cinematic sense. They didn't yell or threaten or kick doors down. They just used, slowly, justified everything in the name of love. Said sacrifice like it was a blessing. Said family comes first, like it meant only some people counted. Tuesday evening, I arrived home to find the living room crowded with extended family. Nico's college acceptance party had come early, and no one had bothered to tell me. I wasn't surprised. My mother greeted me with a glass of lemonade and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I accepted it, nodded politely, and went upstairs to change. When I came down, Nico was showing his friends the acceptance letter again, and Dad was holding court near the dining table like nothing had happened. I stayed quiet through most of the evening, listening, watching, waiting. But when my name came up casually in conversation, something about how Demelapa's editing job has really helped with the bills, I felt something shift again. Not rage, not sadness, just certainty. I excused myself from the table and went upstairs to retrieve the envelope I'd prepared. It held copies of my credit reports, screenshots of the accounts, and a short letter outlining what I knew and what I planned to do next. I placed it on the hallway table outside Dad's office, where he would see it in the morning. I didn't sign it. I didn't have to. The silence in the house that night wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that comes before something breaks. The next morning, my envelope was gone from the table. No one mentioned it, but I noticed the shift instantly. My father didn't meet my eyes at breakfast. My mother moved through the kitchen as if reading from an invisible script, cheerful but distant, over-explaining everything from the grocery list to the weather forecast. Nico was out, likely picking up decorations for the continuation of his Preston celebration. I didn't say anything. I packed my bag as usual, left for work early, and stayed late. Avoiding home like a person avoids a collapsed building they're not ready to sift through. But silence, like pressure, and builds. It doesn't go away. It waits. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening. I walked in after a long day of editing a delayed campaign for a streaming platform and immediately heard my name. My father was in the living room, voice raised, not yelling, just sharp, telling my mother that this kind of betrayal in a family ruins everything. I stepped into the room and asked directly, "Are we talking about the money you stole? Or the car you sold?" His face hardened. My mother stood quickly, as if her body remembered every past moment of tension before her mind could catch up. "Not in front of everyone," she said in a near whisper. But the room was already still. A few family friends looked up from their plates, unsure if they were witnessing a joke or something much worse. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply said, "Dad forged my signature, took out credit in my name, sold my car, then expected me to pay for Nico's tuition." The silence that followed was long and uneven. My father stared at me as if he didn't recognize me. Then he said, "You're misunderstanding what family means. We make sacrifices for each other." That car was sitting there. That credit. But I interrupted. That credit was mine. That debt is real. That signature is illegal. You didn't ask me. You decided. It wasn't the words that shook the room. It was the steadiness behind them. I saw it in the way Nico finally looked up from his phone, confused, glancing between us like he'd missed an entire subplot in a movie he thought he'd been starring in. One of my aunts tried to change the subject. A cousin coughed. My mom reached for my arm. Gently, but I pulled back and said, "Don't. Please. Not this time." My father turned toward me slowly. "You live in this house. You eat our food. You use our water and power. Don't act like you're above this family just because you have a job." My response came, before I could stop it. "I pay rent. I buy my own groceries. I covered the property tax last year, while Nico got a new laptop. So no, I'm not above this family. But I'm tired of being beneath it." I left the room before he could answer. In the hallway, I passed Nico again. He didn't stop me, but he did mutter something like, "You're blowing this way out of proportion." I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I didn't believe it would reach him yet. Some people have to feel the fall themselves to understand the edge you were standing on. Upstairs, I packed quickly. Not everything. Just the things I couldn't afford to lose. My laptop, my contracts, backup drives, passwords, documents. I sent Avery a message, letting her know I'd be crashing on her couch sooner than planned. Her reply was instant. Doors open. Wines chilled. Before I zipped up my bag, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, where I used to keep my social security card and passport. Empty. A sick familiarity crept in. I already knew who had taken them. The same man who taught me that just in case was never about safety, it was about control. Before I left, I stopped at the top of the stairs. The noise from the dining room had resumed. Lower. Fractured. Someone was laughing too hard. Someone else was whispering. I walked down slowly, my suitcase wheels clicking against the tile. My father saw me first. He didn't ask where I was going. My mother stood but said nothing. Nico looked away. I opened the door without a word. And just before I stepped out, I said, I left copies of the accounts in the blue folder on the desk. If anyone wants to know the truth. Outside. The air was cooler than I expected. Autumn in San Diego is subtle. But that night it felt definitive. The Uber arrived 3 minutes later. And I didn't look back. Inside the car, my phone buzzed 3 messages from my mom, asking me to reconsider. I didn't open them. I just stared out the window at the dark silhouettes of houses I once thought held safety. Now, just shapes in the rear view. Avery's apartment was small but clean, filled with the scent of cinnamon tea and the quiet hum of her air purifier. I took off my shoes, dropped my bag by the couch, and let myself exhale for the first time in days. She didn't ask questions right away. She just handed me a blanket and a glass of water and said, "You're safe now." I nodded. But deep down, I knew safety wasn't a place. It was clarity. It was information. And I didn't have enough of it yet. That night, I barely slept. And when I did, I dreamed of padlocks and files, of signing papers I couldn't read, and of Nico wearing my car keys around his neck like a trophy. By morning, I was clear on what I had to do next. I emailed the studio and asked for a mental health day, something they allowed without requiring justification. Then I called in a favor. Miss Janine, from HR, had once mentioned her sister was a consumer protection lawyer. I explained briefly what had happened. And within hours, I had an appointment with a woman named Carla Jensen. She worked out of a modest office in Hillcrest, the kind of place with muted lighting and carefully placed succulents that gave the illusion of calm. Carla shook my hand firmly and didn't interrupt once as I laid out everything, the forged signature, and the credit lines I didn't authorize, the car sale, and the documents I now couldn't find. She took notes as I spoke, then quietly asked, "Have you checked if your name is on any other loans or assets?" I shook my head. She nodded once and said, "We'll pull everything. Full asset trace, public records, soft inquiries. You'll get a complete map." It felt strange hearing someone talk about my life like it was a spreadsheet, but it also felt like control. Not emotional, not reactionary, just truth laid bare. Carla explained that if the signature was forged, and if the accounts were opened without my consent, I had the right to file formal charges. But the next word she said stayed with me. "You don't have to go nuclear right away. Sometimes leverage is more powerful than exposure." Back at Avery's that evening, I opened a shared drive and uploaded everything I had scanned copies, screenshots, emails, old texts with vague financial language from my father. I began organizing them by date, labeling the folder "personal records" like it was just another client file. But unlike the client campaigns I edited every day, this one didn't have a set ending or a clear delivery date. It was my name, my autonomy, my identity, sliced and borrowed and rearranged for someone else's convenience. The following day, Carla sent me a list of loans opened in my name over the last 2 years. 2 of them had been paid off quickly, possibly to avoid raising flags. The third was still active. The most shocking part wasn't the total, it was the purpose. It had been marked as educational support. I hadn't gone back to school. But Nico had. And the payout was timed just a week before his private college acceptance letter had arrived. I felt sick. It wasn't just the money. It was the orchestration. The fact that it had been planned, justified, executed behind smiles and Sunday dinners and casual nods at my generosity. That night, I confronted my mother. Not in person. I wasn't ready, but over the phone. She picked up after 2 rings. Her voice warm like always. Almost relieved to hear from me. I didn't waste time. I told her what I'd found. That my name had been used for loans. That the documents were gone. That a lawyer was now involved. There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing. Then a soft rustle like she was sitting down. "He told me you had agreed," she said quietly. "That you were okay with it. That you were just helping out." My voice didn't rise. I just said, "Did you ever ask me?" Another pause. "No," she admitted. "I didn't think you'd say no. You always help." And that was the sentence. That was the fracture made visible. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true. I always helped. I always made things easier. I always let them take the smoother road. Even if it meant I walked barefoot beside it. But not anymore. I told her I wouldn't press charges if everything was returned. The car or its fair value. The debt refinanced. The documents restored. And a signed admission that I had not, and would not, authorize further use of my identity. She said she didn't know if he'd agree. I said, "Then tell him this is the only version where it doesn't become public." I wasn't bluffing. I had the evidence. I had the right. But more than anything, I had finally learned to use my voice without asking for permission. 3 days passed before my mother called again. Her tone had changed. It was less pleading and more anxious. Like someone trying to put out a fire without knowing where it started. She said, my father had read the demands. That he was upset and disappointed. As if I had broken some unwritten family rule. I asked if he would comply. She hesitated. Then said he had questions. I told her he had 72 hours to respond in writing. And that every conversation moving forward would be documented. She didn't argue. She just said, "Okay," in that small voice I used to associate with long silences after family arguments. The kind that ended with someone slamming a door and someone else crying into a dish towel. But I wasn't in that house anymore. I didn't have to be pulled back into patterns that no longer fit. That evening, I sent Carla the audio from the call and updated the shared drive. Avery sat beside me on the couch, working quietly on her own project. But every now and then, she would glance my way, like she was checking for cracks in the surface. I didn't tell her everything I was feeling, mostly because I wasn't sure what those feelings were yet. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't proud. I was simply watching something rot from the inside. And for once, I wasn't the one holding the mop. Carla sent me a formal reply to forward to my parents. Carefully worded, neutral in tone, but impossible to ignore. It outlined everything they had taken or accessed without consent and offered a final resolution that, if met, would prevent legal escalation. It was firm but merciful. A version of justice that still left room for quiet exit. The following morning, Nico showed up at my office. I was in the middle of reviewing a new cut for a beverage campaign when the front desk buzzed. "There's a young man here asking for you," the receptionist said. A looks upset. I asked if he'd given a name. She said, "He said he's your brother." I asked her to send him up. He stood awkwardly in the glass doorway, hands stuffed into the pockets of his oversized hoodie, eyes darting around the space like he didn't belong. He didn't sit down until I motioned. I waited. Eventually, he said, "I didn't know any of it. About the money, or the car, or the loans. I swear." I believed him. Not because he was particularly convincing, But because his privilege had been so complete, he'd never even considered where things came from. They just appeared. Tuition, laptops, rides. He hadn't asked, because no one had ever asked him to be responsible for anything. But now the illusion was cracking. And the person he thought he knew as the family fixer had stepped off the stage. "Dad said you're trying to ruin us," he continued. "That you're angry and exaggerating." I pulled out my tablet and showed him the folder. Dates, names, account numbers, loan approvals, my name in print, my name in debt. He looked pale by the time he scrolled to the end. "So there's no college fund?" he asked finally. Quietly. "There hasn't been for a long time." I said. "Dad used it, probably to cover debts or gambling or something else you never saw." His eyes dropped to the floor. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "What do I do now?" And for once, I didn't feel like it was my job to answer. "That's up to you," I said gently. "But I'm done being the safety net." That night, Carla called with an update. A background trace had confirmed what I suspected. My father had opened not just loans, but short-term business lines using my social security number, under the name of a consulting company I didn't even know existed. The company was real on paper, but the filings were false. He had listed me as a co-owner, forged my digital signature, and used the address of a mailbox service in another part of the city. It wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. And it had been going on longer than I realized. I sat on the floor for a long time after that call, laptop open beside me, trying to remember when I had last felt in control of my own life. That weekend, Uncle Reuben, my mom's older brother, called unexpectedly. He'd always been distant, someone I only saw at holidays, but he'd apparently heard what was happening. "I had my doubts about Robert for years," he said without preamble, but no one wanted to believe me. He offered to connect me with a friend of his, an internal auditor, who could help assess the long-term financial damage and assist with future identity monitoring. I thanked him, not just for the offer, but for believing me without hesitation. That gesture, as small as it seemed, I felt like a door opening after years of people turning their backs. I ended the call and stared out the window of Avery's apartment. Below, people walked their dogs, carried groceries, laughed into phones. Ordinary moments I used to rush past were now the backdrop to something extraordinary. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was responding. I wasn't shrinking. I was standing. And deep inside, something calm and unshakable had started to take root. The confrontation didn't come with shouting or doors slamming like it might in a movie. It came in quiet layers, like a wall finally giving out from years of hidden cracks. My father didn't respond to the letter. Instead, he sent a text 2 days later that read, "We need to talk, face to face." I didn't reply. I forwarded it to Carla, who advised me not to meet alone. If he wanted to speak, it would be in the presence of witnesses and a clear record. That same evening, I received a string of messages from my mother. Some pleaded for unity, others framed my actions as breaking the family apart, and one simply read, "This is still your father." I sat with those words for a long time, feeling the weight of what they really meant. Not love, not safety, just history, shared blood, the illusion of obligation. That weekend, I met with Uncle Reuben and the auditor he'd recommended. Her name was Marisol, and she had the kind of demeanor that made it clear she'd seen things far worse than this. She spoke in calm, methodical tones as she laid out what she'd found. In addition to the fraudulent loans, there were also unreported cash advances, transactions tied to gambling apps, and multiple short-term insurance claims filed under both my name and my mother's. Some had been closed without payout, flagged for suspicious activity. Others had been approved in small amounts, just enough to avoid detection. The pattern was clear. For years, My father had been piecing together a web of temporary solutions, patching one hole with another while keeping the illusion of stability intact. And he'd done it by using the people closest to him. That night, I found Nico sitting on the curb outside Avery's apartment. His posture was slouched, his eyes red like he hadn't slept. I offered him water, and we sat in silence for a while before he spoke. "Mom's packing," he said. "She said she's not sure if she's leaving for a day or forever." I asked where Dad was. He said he'd locked himself in the home office, refusing to speak to anyone. I asked why Nico had come. He looked down at his hands, then said, "Because I think I finally get it. And because I don't want to be part of this, if it means becoming like him." It wasn't an apology, but it was something. I told him he could sleep on the couch if he needed to. That I didn't hate him, but I wasn't going to protect him from the consequences either. He nodded. "Fair." The next morning, Carla and I filed the formal identity theft complaint with the state's Consumer Bureau and the credit bureaus. We attached all evidence, including the forged business registration, the altered tax documents, and the list of personal data breaches. She made it clear that this would initiate a process, that the police might be involved if certain lenders required a report, that the courts could subpoena financial records if restitution wasn't made voluntarily. It sounded terrifying on paper, but as I clicked submit, all I felt was something clean. Not relief, not revenge, just the removal of a weight that had never belonged to me. Later that afternoon, I drove by the house. I didn't plan to go in. I just wanted to see it one more time before the next steps took hold. The windows were dark, the blinds pulled tight, but I could see the for sale sign now planted in the front yard, angled slightly by the wind. The house that had once been framed as my inheritance, the home I was told I'd always have, now reduced to a listing. And strangely, I didn't feel loss. I felt clarity. This wasn't mine. It never had been. I was just someone who'd filled its cracks until I couldn't anymore. That evening, I received an email from my father. It was longer than I expected. Rambling. Defensive. Then sentimental. He said he had only ever tried to hold the family together. That the gambling had started as a solution to short-term debt. That if I had just waited a little longer, he would have fixed everything. That I had turned Nico and Mom against him. That I had betrayed the one person who always protected me. I didn't reply. I saved the message, filed it under a new folder called Narratives I No Longer Accept, and closed the laptop. Some truths aren't meant to be argued. They're meant to be left behind. At midnight, I stood by the window and watched the city lights flicker like faraway stars. It was quiet, not the silence of fear or tension, but the kind that follows a decision fully made. For the first time in years, I wasn't a version of myself, filtered through someone else's expectations. I wasn't the fixer, the absorber, the peacekeeper. I was just Domalipa, and I was finally enough. 3 weeks after filing the report, I received confirmation that my credit profile had been frozen, and the fraudulent accounts were officially under investigation. The emails came one after another, each like a thread being cut loose from a tangled net. I hadn't even realized I'd been caught in for so long. There was still a long road ahead: legal documentation, identity repair, monitoring services, but the momentum had shifted. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was designing. Quietly, carefully, and on my own terms. Carla helped me initiate a dispute with the loan providers, while Uncle Ruben connected me with a financial consultant who specialized in victims of family fraud. That term made me pause. Victim. It felt too passive, like something had been done to me while I stood still. But I hadn't stood still. I had walked away. I had documented, questioned, protected, resisted. Maybe I wasn't a victim. Maybe I was just someone who finally told the truth and accepted the cost. Nico eventually moved in with a friend near campus, after his acceptance to Preston was withdrawn due to the bounced tuition check and an inquiry from the school's financial office. He texted me a week later, saying he had enrolled at a local community college instead and had started working part-time at a bookstore. I didn't reply right away. I needed time to decide if I believed the change was real or just circumstantial. But when he sent me a photo of his first paycheck, captioned "Earned this one," I felt something shift. Not forgiveness, but maybe the space for it. My mother called again, this time, sounding clearer than I'd heard her in years. She said she had opened her own bank account and was looking into a part-time job at the library near her sister's house. She mentioned that she had been going to therapy. She didn't ask me to come home. She didn't defend him. She only said, I should have paid more attention. I didn't say what I was thinking, that paying attention wouldn't have stopped him. But it might have helped me feel less alone. Still, I told her I was glad she was starting over. That she deserved better. Too, there wasn't warmth in the conversation. But there was a kind of mutual respect, a recognition that we were both women rebuilding something from wreckage we hadn't created alone. At work, things began to stabilize. I was promoted quietly to senior editor after delivering 2 major projects ahead of schedule, despite everything happening in the background. My manager didn't know the details, only that I had been dealing with a complex personal situation. When she called me into her office and handed me the paperwork, she said, You've held your ground with grace. That doesn't go unnoticed. It wasn't just a title. It was the first time I felt like I was being seen, not as someone surviving, but someone building. I moved into a small studio in North Park 2 blocks from Avery's place. Walking distance to work? Sunlight pouring through the kitchen window every morning. The first night I slept there, I stood barefoot on the cold tile floor, looking at my own furniture, my own keys, my own choices. No one could take this from me. Not legally. Not emotionally. I left a lamp on overnight just because I could. Just because it was mine to leave. That morning, I woke up and made coffee without fear of someone asking what I owed them for it. The car situation resolved in a way I hadn't expected. The buyer, apparently a former client of my dad's, returned the vehicle after receiving a legal notice from Carla. He had paid far below market value and didn't want trouble. I picked up the car in a grocery store parking lot, keys handed over without a word. The tires were worn. The back seat smelled faintly of smoke, but it was still mine. I drove it straight to a mechanic. I got it serviced, replaced the air filter, changed the oil, and paid for everything from the new account I'd opened under my own name. I didn't text anyone when it was done. I didn't post about it. I just drove home with the windows down, music playing low, like I had nothing to prove anymore. The day I deleted the shared folder labeled evidence from my desktop was quiet. No big gesture. No ceremonial goodbye. Just a single click and a slow breath. I had already stored everything safely offline, and Carla still had backups. But I no longer wanted to see those files every time I opened my computer. I wasn't in defense mode anymore. I was in forward motion. I was choosing peace not because I had forgotten what happened, but because I had survived it without becoming like them. The first time I saw my father after everything unfolded was not in a courtroom or a lawyer's office like I had expected. It was in a grocery store aisle, next to the frozen food section. Early on a Sunday morning, when most people were still asleep. I almost didn't recognize him at first. He looked smaller somehow, shoulders hunched. His usual commanding presence dimmed under a plain gray sweatshirt and a plastic basket filled with discounted canned goods. He didn't see me right away. I had a split second to decide, turn down another aisle, pretend I didn't notice, or walk forward. I chose to walk. Not because I wanted to speak to him, but because I wasn't afraid of being seen anymore. When he finally looked up and saw me, his face flickered with something I couldn't quite name: shock, regret, or maybe just weariness. Domelipa, he said, voice lower than I remembered. I didn't expect to run into you. I nodded. I didn't return the name. I didn't ask how he was. I didn't offer pleasantries. There was no smile. Only silence. Then, slowly, he said, I've been trying to get help. Financial counseling. I've stopped gambling. Your mother left 2 weeks ago. She's staying with her sister now. I let the words land without comment. Part of me wanted to ask if he thought that erased what he'd done. If he imagined this update would somehow unlock an emotional return. But I stayed quiet. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had already said everything that mattered. He looked down at the basket, then back at me. I know I lost your trust. I know I can't fix it. But I want you to know, I never meant to hurt you. I nodded again. Slowly. Then I replied with the first honest thing I'd ever said to him without fear of the consequence. You hurt me because you thought I wouldn't leave. But I did. And I won't come back to that version of family. He looked away. Not angry. Just exposed. And for the first time, I realized how unfamiliar I had become to him. I wasn't the daughter who patched the leaks anymore. I wasn't the one who stayed quiet when something was taken. I was just a woman he once raised, who now had boundaries he couldn't control. We didn't speak further. I turned and walked away. My hands weren't shaking. My chest wasn't tight. I didn't feel vengeance or even sadness. I felt intact. Later that day, I told Carla about the run-in, just to keep everything documented. She listened, then said, That's the moment you stop being someone he can narrate. That's yours now. I wrote it down in my journal that night, not as a milestone, but as a reminder. Closure isn't always dramatic. Sometimes, it's just walking away without needing the last word. Over the next few weeks, my life settled into a rhythm I had once only dreamed about. Work became more than survival. It became creative again. I started mentoring a junior editor named Jada, a sharp and soft-spoken woman who reminded me of myself 5 years earlier. Teaching her made me realize how far I'd come. Not just in skills, but in clarity. I spoke at a panel for women in media and told my story anonymously, as D, to a room full of strangers. The questions afterward weren't about betrayal or scandal. They were about recovery, about boundaries, about how to protect your future when the threat comes from within the people you're told to trust most. Nico texted me again in late March. He said he'd passed all his midterms and had applied for a scholarship with an essay titled The Real Cost of Family. I didn't ask to read it. I didn't need to. His growth wasn't mine to track. He was learning. Slowly. On his own terms. That was enough. My mother eventually sent a handwritten letter. It arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. And inside was a single page. She apologized not for what she had allowed, but for what she hadn't protected me from. She wrote that she was seeing things differently now. Not through blame, but through awareness. She ended the letter by saying, You taught me that leaving isn't betrayal. Sometimes it's clarity. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in the back of my journal. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't care, but because I believed her words had been sent to stand on their own. That spring, I planted herbs in pots along my apartment window. Basil, thyme, mint, tiny things that needed sunlight and patience. But nothing else. Every time I watered them, I remembered that growth isn't always loud or fast. Sometimes, it's just a decision to stay where the light reaches, even if it takes time to feel the warmth. 6 months passed, then 8. And the distance between me and who I used to be grew wider. Not just in time, but in perspective. My apartment began to feel like more than a place I slept. It became mine in the quietest, most meaningful ways. I knew where the sunlight landed at 5:30. I knew which neighbors walked their dogs, and which ones played jazz records late into the night. I had favorite mugs. I had evenings that ended with silence, not tension. And above all, I had choices. Every decision in my life now had my name on it. not someone else's version of what I owed. One day, in early summer, my manager pulled me aside after a client meeting and told me a position was opening up in our new creative lead track. She said she thought I should apply, not just because I was qualified, but because she'd watched how I led with steadiness during chaos. She said, "Some people push work forward. You pull people through it." I smiled, but inside, I was quietly stunned. A year ago, I would have turned it down. I'm afraid of what extra weight it might bring. But now, I wasn't afraid of responsibility. I just refused to carry it for people who weaponized my reliability. I submitted my application the same day and scheduled a conversation with Carla to review long-term steps for protecting my identity moving forward. She suggested enrolling in credit monitoring, locking down personal data, and eventually having the record of the fraudulent activity annotated for future financial interactions. It was strange, thinking about my future, not as a defensive response to damage, but as something I could plan and build from zero, like a clean foundation. I left her office that day, with a folder under my arm, and a feeling I hadn't known in years. I wasn't bracing anymore. I was building. A week later, I met with Nico at a coffee shop near his new apartment. A looked healthier, more grounded. He'd cut his hair. I started volunteering at a local nonprofit and talked about saving for his own car. The conversation wasn't heavy. It wasn't an apology tour. We talked about normal things, rent prices, late-night ramen places, classes that were harder than expected. Near the end, he paused and said, "I used to think you were selfish for pulling away. Now I get it. You weren't pulling away. You were protecting yourself." I nodded, then said, "It's possible to care about people and still say no." He didn't argue. He just said, "I'm trying to get better at that." That night, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, thinking about how strange and gentle healing could feel when no one's rushing you through it. I remembered my 25th birthday, the one where I worked a double shift, came home to find my car gone, and got told to be grateful for a roof over my head. I remembered the rain on my face, the heaviness in my chest, the quiet clarity that had risen from the wreckage. That was the night everything broke. But now, months later, I saw it differently. That was the night something began. I didn't need a dramatic comeback. I didn't need to broadcast the wins or rub the losses in anyone's face. The real revenge, if it could even be called that, wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about reclaiming the version of myself that had never gotten to lead the story. The version that wasn't just a daughter, or a provider, or a fixer. The version that knew peace wasn't earned through pleasing people who would take until you disappeared. My father never contacted me again after that day in the grocery store. From what I heard through Ruben, he sold the house to cover mounting debts and moved into a rental in a quieter part of town. There were no lawsuits filed against him. No public consequences. Just the slow unraveling of a life built on silence and exploitation. He became smaller in the rearview, not out of hatred, but because I had stopped driving in his direction. My mother, on the other hand, began writing again. Not to ask for anything, but to share things she was learning. She started a part-time job at the library and began attending financial literacy workshops for women. Sometimes, she'd mail me articles clipped from the local paper, with yellow highlights and sticky notes. I didn't always reply, but I read every word. On the 1-year anniversary of the day I left home, I cooked dinner for a few close friends in my apartment. Nothing extravagant. Just pasta, candles, music playing low. Avery brought lemon cake. Jada showed up with homemade bread and a bottle of wine. At some point during the evening, someone asked me what changed most in the past year. I didn't hesitate. I stopped asking who I needed to become to be loved, and started asking what it would mean to love myself without permission. The room went quiet, not because it was profound, but because it was true. The invitation came in early November, printed on soft cream cardstock with silver lettering. The kind you only order when you want people to think you've arrived somewhere respectable. It was a small gathering, my cousin's engagement party, hosted by my aunt in the same neighborhood I grew up in. At first, I left it on the kitchen counter, unread, like it might evaporate if I ignored it long enough. But something about the careful wording, the way my name was addressed without a title or an apology, made me pause. It wasn't a request. It wasn't an outreach. It was just an assumption that I would come, that I was still part of the story. I didn't RSVP. I didn't need to. A week before the party, my mom called, asking gently if I planned to show up. Her voice sounded steadier than it used to, and for a moment, I almost softened. But then she said, it would mean a lot to the family, and I felt the weight return. The old framework of guilt wrapped in civility. I told her the truth, that I hadn't decided yet, that I didn't owe anyone my presence. She didn't argue, just said, we'll understand, whatever you choose. And for once, I believed her. The day of the party came. I didn't wear anything loud or performative, just a clean black dress, a neutral lip color, and the quiet certainty that I didn't need to prove who I was to anyone anymore. I arrived late, parked 3 blocks away on purpose, and walked slowly through the neighborhood. I once called home. The streets were familiar, but they didn't feel like they belonged to me. That feeling used to hurt. Now, it felt like closure. Inside, the house buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses. I spotted Nico near the drinks table, helping the caterers with trays, sleeves rolled up. Smile. Easy. He caught my eye and nodded once. Not performance. Just recognition. That was enough. My aunt greeted me briefly, then moved on. No one asked where I'd been. No one brought up the car, the accounts, or the day I left without a word. The silence wasn't awkward. It was deliberate. They had rewritten the story in their heads, probably making me the distant cousin who needed space or had a rough year. That didn't bother me. Let them build their version. I had mine, and it didn't require their permission. Toward the end of the night, as people started saying their goodbyes, my father walked in. I hadn't expected him to come. He looked older than I remembered, like someone who'd been living in lowercase letters after years of shouting. He didn't make a scene, just stood in the hallway for a few seconds, scanning the room like a man looking for something he lost long ago. Then he saw me. For a long second, neither of us moved. Then I gave a polite nod, not out of obligation, but because I wasn't hiding. He nodded back, then turned to speak to an old colleague near the doorway. That was it. No confrontation, no apology, just the quiet agreement that whatever used to bind us had unraveled, and neither of us needed to knot it back together. I left shortly after, walking back to my car through the cool air, coat wrapped around my arms. The night was still, the kind that makes every step sound louder. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel broken. I just felt clear. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't a comeback. This was the quiet result of choosing myself over and over, even when it cost more than it comforted. The girl who had once worked a double shift on her birthday while her family sold her car in her absence wasn't standing here anymore. And she didn't need justice to move on. She just needed distance and her own name back. Weeks later, I got promoted. Not because someone finally gave me what I deserved, but because I kept doing the work, even when no one clapped. Jada took on more clients. Avery and I started working on a podcast for young creatives navigating burnout. Carla sent me a thank you note after I referred another client to her. Life didn't turn perfect, but it turned real. And that was more than enough. The last line in my journal that year wasn't poetic or clever. It just said, they thought I'd fall apart quietly. I didn't. I rebuilt where they couldn't see. What would you do if your own family crossed the line and still expected you to come home like nothing happened?